Water is the one thing a man cannot build. He can raise a wall from stone and mud and the patience of his own two hands. He can lay a roof of cedar shakes split from a log he felled himself. He can strike a fire from flint and dry grass and coax it into something that will warm a room through a winter night. But he cannot build water. Water comes from the sky or it comes from the ground. And when it stops coming from both every living thing that depends on it, which is every living thing that has ever drawn breath, stops with it. The summer of 1886 in southern Missouri was the summer the water stopped. The rain that should have fallen in May did not fall. The rain that should have fallen in June did not fall. And by the time July arrived, the sky above Greene County had become a pale blank sheet of white that offered nothing and took everything, pulling the moisture from the soil and the creeks and the wells and the bodies of every man and beast that stood beneath it. But before the drought, before the wells failed, before the cattle stood at dry troughs, with their heads down and their sides heaving, there was a woman alone on a stretch of burnt ground 12 miles southeast of Springfield. Her name was Maribel Hensley. She was 24 years old. She was 5 feet and 2 inches tall, and she weighed 110 pounds, and she had inherited a ruin. The ruin had been a sawmill. It had belonged to her husband, Orrin Hensley, a man broader in the shoulder and quieter in the mouth than most men on Birch Creek. And she had married him when she was 17 years old in a clapboard church outside Springfield with a borrowed veil and a pair of boots that did not yet fit her feet. Orrin had run the mill for 7 years by his own hand, and for the last 3 of those years, Maribel had run it with him. She had stacked green lumber until her arms shook. She had pulled a cant hook through logs that weighed 6 times what she weighed. She had learned which sound a saw blade makes when it is cutting clean and which sound it makes when it is about to catch a knot and throw a log free of the carriage. She had been standing near the blade housing on the afternoon of the 10th of August in 1885, when a log did throw free of the carriage, and it did not strike her. It struck Orrin Hensley across the chest, and it killed him before he reached the ground. She had buried him on the ridge above the mill beneath a white oak tree, and she had gone on cutting for the orders already placed because the money was needed, and the lumber was half sawn, and there was no one else to finish it. And then on a windless night in the October that followed, the sawdust pile caught fire from a spark no one ever identified. And by morning, the cutting shed and the blade housing and the drying racks were a pile of charred timbers that smoked for 3 more days after the flames were out. She spent the winter in a rented room above the feed store in Springfield. She spent it reading the mill ledger Orrin had kept in his own hand, and she spent it looking at the ceiling at night, and she spent it in silence because the grief had done itself in the weeks after the funeral, and there was none left in her by the time the snow came. And in April, when the ground thawed and the roads dried enough to travel, she loaded a borrowed wagon with the few things she owned, and she drove herself back to the burnt place on Birch Creek. She was 24 years old. She was a widow. She had no money to rebuild a sawmill, no partner to help her try, and no particular reason anyone in the settlement could see for her to return to the site at all. She returned anyway. She stood in the wagon seat when the road came over the last low rise before the creek, and she looked down at what was left of her husband's work. The stone foundation of the cutting shed sat in the sun like the skeleton of some great animal that had lain down in the grass and given up its flesh to the weather. Cut limestone blocks laid by masons 50 years gone rose 3 feet out of the earth in a neat rectangle 14 feet wide and 20 feet long. Inside the rectangle, nothing but ash and blackened beams and the charred stump of what had once been the drying rack post. The blade itself, the 5-foot circular saw blade that had cut every plank Orrin had ever sold, lay in the grass beside the foundation where the fire had dropped it when the housing collapsed. Heated red once but not warped. Still true. Below the foundation, the mill dam stood unbroken. 12 feet wide and 6 feet tall, stone and packed earth holding back a pond of water the color of weak tea. And from the dam running along a gentle gradient toward the old cutting shed, the mill race. 200 feet of stone-lined channel 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, carrying water from the pond down to where the wheel had stood. The race was choked with silt and roots and 50 years of accumulated debris, but the stones of the channel walls were still sound, and the gradient was still true, and the water still moved through it, slow and narrow and steady, the way water moves when it has been given a shape to follow, and is simply going where the shape tells it to go. Maribel climbed down from the wagon. She walked the perimeter of the foundation. She put her hand on the top course of the limestone wall, and she felt the cold of the stone against her palm, a cold that runs deeper than any frost, a cold that comes from the weight and the patience of the rock itself. She walked down to the dam. She walked the length of the mill race. She counted the stones that had come loose and the stones that still held. She stood at the head of the race where the water entered from the pond, and she bent down and put her hand in the flow, and the water ran cold between her fingers, the way creek water runs cold even in August, because creek water in the Ozarks is spring-fed, and spring water comes out of the ground at 48 degrees every day of every year, regardless of what the sun is doing above it. She straightened up. She wiped her hand on her apron. She looked at the foundation and the blade and the race in the dam, and she did not see a ruin. She saw a machine. That was the thing the settlement never understood about Maribel Hensley, and it was the thing that would save 7 families before the summer was out. She did not look at what a place had been. She looked at what a place was still doing. The sawmill was finished, but the mill race was not finished. The mill race was carrying water 40 gallons a minute in normal years, cold and constant, and running by gravity alone, and water that runs by gravity does not stop for heat or weather or the death of the man who built the channel. Water that runs by gravity runs until the channel breaks or the source fails, and neither had happened here. She set up a canvas lean-to that first night, pitched against the south wall of the foundation, and she slept on a straw tick laid directly on the stone floor of what had once been the cutting shed. She did not sleep much. The ashes had been washed thin by 6 months of rain and melted snow, but the smell was still there. The smell a burnt building carries for years after the flames are out. A smell that lives in the soil and in the cracks between the stones and comes up when a foot disturbs it. She lay on the straw tick with her cheek against the limestone floor, and she breathed the smell of burnt pine and old fire, and she listened to the water running in the mill race 20 feet away. And somewhere around the second hour before dawn, she got up and walked the length of the race again by the light of the setting moon, because the plan had started to form in her head, and she needed to see the ground. She spent the first 3 days clearing the interior of the foundation. She wore Oren's old leather gloves, the palms stiff with years of resin and pitch, and she carried ash and charred beams out to a burn pile in the field behind the foundation, and she set fire to it in the evening and watched the old work of the fire finish itself. On the 4th day, she found the box. It was in the southeast corner of the foundation beneath a flagstone that had been lifted and set back slightly askew, the way a stone looks when it has been lifted by a man who did not want anyone else to know he had lifted it. The flagstone was the size of a dinner plate, and it took her 3 tries with a pry bar before it came free, and beneath it, set into a small hollow in the earth, was a tin box about the size of a family Bible. The tin was rusted at the corners, but the lid was still tight, and when she worked the lid free with the tip of the pry bar, the paper inside was dry. She sat down on the stone floor with the box in her lap. She lifted the paper out of the tin box and she saw her husband's handwriting, the careful square letters he used when he was drawing plans. And something broke open in her chest that she had kept sealed since the day the log struck him. And she wept for the first time since that afternoon. And she wept until the paper in her hands shook and she had to set it down on the stone beside her to keep from smearing the ink. The paper was a plan, a drawing in Oren's hand done in pencil with the measurements marked in ink, showing the stone foundation of the cutting shed reconfigured into a dwelling. The walls built up to 7 feet of the same limestone. The roof set on salvaged timbers. The mill race diverted at the northwest corner of the foundation, its flow split into 2 channels, one running through the interior of the building along the north wall as a shallow stone trough, the other running outside the foundation to a garden plot laid out on the south side. There were notes in the margins. The interior channel was marked for cooling and for storage of dairy. The exterior channel was marked for irrigation of vegetable beds. The thermal properties of an 18-inch limestone wall were calculated in orange small neat figures on the back of the page. And at the bottom of the drawing, in a hand that was not quite as steady as the rest, he had written a single line. "If the mill should fail, this is what the land will still give you." She read the line 3 times. She folded the paper and put it back in the tin. She set the tin on the flagstone beside her. She sat in the quiet of the ruined building with the sound of the mill race running outside and the smell of old fire in the stone beneath her, and she understood several things at once that she had not understood when she woke up that morning. She understood that her husband had thought about his own death. She understood that he had thought about it enough to sit down with a pencil and a sheet of paper and work out what his wife would do if he were not there to work beside her. She understood that he had hidden the drawing because he did not want to speak of it while he was alive, because a man does not speak aloud of his own dying to the woman he married when she was 17, but he had left it where she would find it if she came back to the place after he was gone. And she understood that what she had been planning since she stood on the wagon seat 3 days ago was not her plan alone. It was his plan too. He had seen it first. He had drawn it first. He had known somehow that the mill would not last, or that he would not last, or that some combination of the two would come to pass, and he had prepared the ground for her while he still could. She put the tin box back in its hollow beneath the flagstone. She set the stone back in place. She went outside and she stood by the mill race in the afternoon sun, and she spoke aloud for the first time since she had come back to the land, and what she said was short, and it was not addressed to anyone living. She said, "I found it, Oren. I will finish what you started." And after she said it, she got her shovel and she began to clear silt from the channel. The work of clearing the mill race took her 2 weeks. She worked from first light to the last reachable hour of dusk. She shoveled silt onto the bank in long black heaps, and she pulled willow roots out of the joints between the stones with a grubbing hoe, and she reset the loose stones that had been dislodged by freezing and thawing over 50 winters, tapping them back into line with a wooden mallet so she would not chip the limestone. The race had narrowed to perhaps 18 inches of effective channel by the time she started. When she finished, it was 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, the way the masons had built it in the 1830s, and the flow that came down out of the dam was full and steady, the measure of what Birch Creek could give. She heard that flow every hour of the day after she finished the clearing. It made a sound like a distant wind, constant and low, a sound that did not rise and did not fall, a sound that told her the water was still moving and therefore the plan was still possible. It was the first sound in 8 months that had made her feel anything other than tired. The settlement took note of her work because the settlement took note of everything on Birch Creek. The settlement was 11 families scattered across 4,000 acres of ridge and hollow, and its social center was Durant's General Store in Springfield, and its unofficial spokesman on any subject involving the Sawmill site was a man named Silas Cobb. Silas Cobb owned the farm on the opposite bank of Birch Creek. He was 56 years old that summer, a tall man with a long gray mustache and the particular stiffness of spine that comes to a man who has worked outdoors his whole life and has begun without admitting it to feel the weather in his joints. He had bought lumber from Orrin Hensley's mill for 10 years, and he had thought well of Orrin in the distant, impractical way that neighbors think well of one another on a frontier where affection is not spoken of and respect is paid in the form of honest accounts settled at the end of each quarter. He had been at the funeral. He had sent his wife with a basket of smoked ham. He had not, in the 8 months since the funeral, set foot on the sawmill side of the creek because he did not know what to say to a widow who was half his age, and he was not a man who spoke unless he was certain of what he was about to say. On a morning in early May, Silas Cobb stood inside Durant's General Store with 3 other men and a tin cup of coffee, and he said what the settlement had been waiting for someone to say. "The girl came back," he said. "I saw her hauling silt yesterday. She is going to hurt herself." The men murmured. One of them, a farmer named Tobias Pelham, whose land lay 2 miles up the ridge, said she would not listen to reason. Another, a man named Wyatt Kendrick, said he had offered to buy the salvaged blade from her for $8, and she had told him she was not ready to sell anything. "That mill is finished," Silas said. "The equipment is wrecked. The building is gone, and the girl has not got the money to rebuild either one. Best she can do is sell the blade for scrap and the land for timber rights and start over somewhere that does not smell like smoke." The men nodded. Silas drank his coffee. None of them said what they were also thinking, which was that a widow of 24 who remained on a burnt homestead 12 miles from the nearest town and refused the counsel of her neighbors would not last the year, and that when she left the land would come cheap to whichever neighbor had the cash in hand and the patience to wait. Silas Cobb had the cash. Silas Cobb had in fact been thinking about the land across the creek for longer than he was prepared to admit to anyone, including himself. The Hensley parcel included the only dam on Birch Creek between the Spring Head and the confluence with the Gasconade River, and a man who controlled that dam controlled the water supply for 1,000 acres of pasture, and Silas Cobb kept 90 head of cattle and had been contemplating for 3 years an expansion to 200. He rode to the mill site on the first Saturday in May. He found Maribel setting stone along the upper courses of the west wall. She had built a scaffold of salvaged lumber against the foundation, and she was laying limestone blocks she had hauled one by one from the collapsed chimney pile, setting them in lime mortar she had mixed in a wooden trough. She was wearing a faded cotton work dress and a canvas apron and Orrin's old leather gloves, and her hair was pinned under a cotton bonnet, and she had a smear of lime mortar across her left cheek that she did not know was there. Silas dismounted at the edge of the foundation, and he stood with the reins of his horse in his hand, and he waited for her to notice him. She did not turn for a full minute. When she did turn, she did not climb down from the scaffold. She looked at him across the top of the wall she was building, and she waited. "Mrs. Hensley," Silas said. "Mr. Cobb," Maribel said. He cleared his throat. He was not a man who had rehearsed many speeches, and the one he had rehearsed on the ride over had abandoned him the moment she looked at him. He said he had come to pay his respects. He said he was sorry for her loss. He said he was sorry it had taken him so long to come over. She nodded once at each of these statements, and she did not climb down from the scaffold, and she did not offer him water or a place to sit. And after a moment, Silas came to the thing he had actually come to say. He said he understood her situation. He said he understood that a woman alone on a burnt mill site was in a hard place, and that the rebuilding of a sawmill was beyond the means of anyone but a company with capital, and that the land itself without the mill was of limited use to her. He said he would be willing to make an offer. He named a figure, $400 for the full parcel, including the dam and the mill race and the foundation and the standing timber. He said she could take the money and begin again somewhere that did not carry the weight of what had happened there. He said it would be a kindness to her and a kindness to the settlement to let the land pass to someone who could use it. Maribel listened. She did not interrupt. She waited until he had finished, and then she waited a moment longer, and then she asked him a single question. Mr. Cobb, she said, if you bought this land, what would you do with the dam? Silas Cobb was a good man in many ways, but he was not a good liar, and he had not prepared for the question. He hesitated. The hesitation was a half-second long, and in that half-second, Maribel Hensley saw everything she needed to see. He said he had not thought about it particularly. He said he supposed the dam would remain. He said the water would go on running, it always had. Maribel nodded slowly. She climbed down from the scaffold. She walked to where he stood at the edge of the foundation, and she looked up at him, because he was a foot taller than she was, and she said what she had to say in a voice that was not angry and was not cold, but was simply clear. She said she appreciated his offer. She said she understood he meant it as a kindness. She said she was not going to sell. She said the dam and the race and the foundation were her inheritance, and she intended to make use of them, and she would not be selling any part of the parcel to him or to anyone else now or at any time she could presently foresee. Silas put his hat back on. He said he understood. He said if she ever changed her mind, the offer would stand. He said good day to her, and he mounted his horse, and he rode back across the creek. She watched him go. She watched him until he crossed the low-water ford and rode up the opposite bank and disappeared into the tree line that marked the edge of his pasture. Then she climbed back onto the scaffold, and she picked up her trowel and she set another stone. She lay on her straw tick inside the half-built walls that night, and she thought about the hesitation. The half-second pause before he said he had not thought about the dam particularly. A man does not pause before answering a question about land he intends to buy unless he has thought about the land a great deal. A man who has thought about the land a great deal and does not wish to say what he has thought is a man with a plan he does not want a widow to know about. And a man with a plan involving her dam was a man she would need to watch. She watched. She did not speak of Silas Cobb's visit to anyone because there was no one to speak of it to, and because she did not yet have any evidence of anything beyond a hesitation. But she kept her eye on the creek upstream of the well, and on the second week of May, she found what she had been watching for. She walked the creek bank every morning at first light before the heat of the day set in. On the morning of the 14th of May, she walked farther than usual up past the point where her own property line ended and the open timber began, and she saw it before she reached the bend in the creek where the land started to rise toward the ridge. A rut in the bank, a fresh rut, perhaps 18 inches wide, cut into the soft earth on the east bank of Birch Creek, about 200 yards upstream of her dam. The rut ran at an angle down to the creek and then continued on the other side, rising up the bank and across a flat piece of bottom land toward a small dry draw that emptied southeast away from her property toward the pasture on Silas Cobb's side of the ridge. Someone had begun to dig a diversion channel. Not finished, perhaps half finished. A few hours of work with a shovel enough to test how long it would take to complete and how much water it would carry when it was done. Whoever had dug it had scattered leaves over the raw earth to disguise the work, but leaves do not disguise fresh digging. Not to a woman who had been watching the creek for 2 weeks and who knew the exact look of every foot of bank above her dam. She stood beside the rut for a long time. She did not speak. She did not move. She looked at the angle of the cut in the direction of the draw, and she calculated in her head how much water such a channel would divert if it were completed, enough to reduce her race significantly, enough if the summer turned hot to make the difference between a flowing race and a failing one. She walked back to the dam. She found a shovel. She walked back up the creek to the half-dug diversion and she filled it in. She worked for 3 hours. She pulled the loosened earth back into the rut. She tamped it down with the flat of the shovel. She covered the tamped earth with leaves and creek stones, the way the digger had tried to cover his own work. And by the time she was finished, the bank looked almost as it had looked before anyone had touched it. Almost. A person who had not known the ground would not have seen a rut there at all. A person who had known the ground well would have seen that the earth had been disturbed and then repaired. She did not go to Silas Cobb. She did not ride to Springfield. She did not speak of the diversion to anyone because she had no witnesses and no proof and no means of compelling a confession, and a 24-year-old widow accusing her 56-year-old neighbor of sabotage without evidence would be dismissed by every man in the county who heard the accusation. She did what a woman with no power and no allies does when she discovers that someone has moved against her. She filled in the cut, she said nothing, and she began to plan as if the move would be made again. She walked the creek every morning from that day forward. She walked it at first light and again at dusk. She memorized every foot of the bank for half a mile above the dam. She learned the exact position of every rock, every snag, every slump of clay, so that she would know within an hour if anything changed. And while she walked and watched, she went on building. She laid stone on the west wall. She laid stone on the north wall. She cut salvaged timber to length for the roof frame. She split cedar shingles from a log she had floated down the mill race from the standing timber above the dam, and she stacked the shingles in neat bundles against the couth wall of the foundation, and she did not let the work of the building slow while she was watching for the work of the digging. The digging did not return. Whether Silas had understood that she had found it, or whether he had thought better of it on his own, the bank above the dam remained undisturbed through the rest of May and into June. The watch continued anyway. There are some things a woman begins that she does not stop simply because the reason for starting has not repeated itself. The weeks passed. May turned into June. The rain that should have fallen in May had not fallen. The rain that should have fallen in June did not fall either. The farmers of Greene County began to look at the sky in the particular way that farmers look at a sky that is not doing what a sky is supposed to do. The pastures began to yellow at the edges. The corn came up thin and short, and the leaves began to curl by the middle of the month. The shallow wells, the ones dug only to the first water table, began to drop. Tobias Pelham was the first to remark on it at Durant's store. He said his well had dropped 6 inches in a week. Wyatt Kendrick said the same. Silas Cobb, his own well was holding, but that his cattle tank was lower than he liked to see in June. Maribel said nothing. She was not at Durant's store. She was on Birch Creek building. The west wall rose to 5 feet, then to 6, then to 7. The north wall followed. She set the lintel stones over the door and the windows. She framed the roof with salvaged pine from the burnt cutting shed, the fire-damaged surfaces planed smooth with a draw knife until only sound wood remained. She fitted the rafters. She nailed the cedar shingles course by course, starting at the eaves and working up toward the ridge, and the roof closed in over the foundation toward the end of June, like a lid being set on a box. By the 1st of July, the building was weather-tight. 4 walls of 18-inch limestone, a roof of salvaged timber and hand-split cedar, a door of planed oak hung on forged iron hinges. Orrin had made the winter before he died. 2 windows on the south wall, 4 windows on the east and west, each glazed with small panes of glass she had carried from Springfield, wrapped in newsprint in a basket on her lap. A stone chimney rising from the north wall, built of the same limestone as the walls, its firebox sized for a small iron cook stove she had not yet purchased, but for which the opening was ready. The interior was raw. She had not yet laid the floor mats, had not yet built the shelves, had not yet run the interior water channel. But the shell was closed. A woman alone in a burnt ruin in April had by the 1st of July built herself a stone house. She stood outside the south wall on the evening of the 1st of July, and she looked at what she had made. The sun was setting behind the ridge on Silas Cobb's side of the creek, and the light came in low and red across the new stone, and the whitewash she had applied to the south wall that morning caught the red light and gave it back in a softer color, almost pink, a color she would not see again except at that hour of that kind of day. The swallows were working the air above the mill race. The water was running in the race the way it had been running for 50 years. The thermometer she had nailed to the north side of the door read 94 degrees. She went inside. The interior was 79 degrees, 15 degrees cooler than the air outside, and she had not yet run the water channel. The stone was doing what Orrin had said in the notes on the back of the plan that stone would do. She put her hand on the interior face of the west wall, and she felt the coolness in it, and she stood with her palm against the stone for a long time, and she thought of his hands drawing the measurements on the paper, and she was grateful in a way that went deeper than any word for gratitude she knew. The heat came on in the first week of July, the way a fever comes on in a sick child. Slow at first, and then all at once. On the 2nd of July, the thermometer outside Maribel's door read 96 at mid-afternoon. On the 5th, it read 100. On the 7th, it read 104, and the sky above Birch Creek had gone from pale blue to that flat white that is not a color so much as the absence of one, a white that looked like chalk rubbed across a slate, and the cicadas in the sycamores along the creek were screaming in the middle of the morning, instead of waiting for afternoon, the way cicadas scream when the heat has pushed them past whatever it is in an insect that keeps its own time. Maribel worked in the early hours and the late hours, and she stayed inside the stone house through the middle of the day. The house was doing what Orrin had said it would do. At mid-afternoon on the 7th, with the outside thermometer reading 104, the interior of the stone house read 78. 26 degrees of difference between the outside air and the inside air, held there by 18 inches of limestone, and a roof with an 18-inch overhang that shaded the south wall from the direct sun, and a coat of lime whitewash that threw the light back instead of drinking it in. She put her hand on the south wall at noon, and the stone was warm to the touch, but not hot. By evening, the stone had given back what it had taken, radiating the day's heat into the cooling night air, and by morning the interior face of the wall was cool again, ready to absorb another day's heat without passing it through. She ran the interior water channel on the 9th of July. She'd been saving the work for the worst of the heat because she wanted to see what it would do when the outside air was at its hottest. She diverted the mill race at the northwest corner of the foundation into a shallow stone trough she had built along the base of the north wall inside the house. The trough was 6 inches wide and 4 inches deep, cut into the floor lined with flat limestone slabs she had fitted so close together that the water ran over them without pooling. The water entered at the northwest corner, flowed the length of the north wall, and exited through the east foundation into a short tail race that carried it back to Birch Creek below the mill site. The effect inside the house was immediate. The air along the channel cooled by evaporation. Moisture lifted off the surface of the flowing water and dropped the temperature another 6 degrees and brought the humidity up to a level where the air felt like a spring morning in a room that was surrounded by July. She put a crock of butter directly in the flowing water weighted with a stone so it would not lift, and she watched the butter stay firm through the hottest hour of the day. She put a stoneware jug of milk in the channel beside the butter. The milk stayed sweet. She had no ice and no spring house and no root cellar yet dug, but she had a 48-degree channel of creek water running through her kitchen, and the kitchen was cooler than any parlor in the settlement. And the food in the channel stayed cold the way food stays cold in January. She stood beside the channel on the evening of the 9th, and she listened to the water running in the stone. It made a sound like a small, steady rain falling on a tin roof very far away. A sound that did not change. A sound that told her the system was working. Outside, the settlement was beginning to break. Tobias Pelham's well went dry on the 9th of July. The bucket came up with a wet rim of clay and nothing else, and Tobias stood in his yard with the empty bucket in his hand, and he called for his oldest boy to hitch the wagon, and he drove to Durant's store in Springfield, and he bought 3 empty hogshead barrels on credit, and he drove back home, and he did not know yet what he was going to put in them, only that he was going to have to put something in them before the week was out. On the 12th of July, Wyatt Kendrick's well failed. On the 15th, the well at the Harlan Brannock place on the ridge failed. On the 18th, the Crenshaw family's well, which had been dug 42 feet down through hard-pan clay in the spring of 1882, pulled up its last bucket of muddy water and then pulled up nothing. The shallow wells went first of all of them in the space of 2 weeks, and then the deeper wells began to drop. An inch a day on the best of them, 2 inches on the worst. The farmers stood in their yards at the pump handle and they worked the lever, and they watched the water come up cloudy and slow, and they listened to the sucking sound that told them the pipe was drawing air along with water. And they knew what the sound meant because they had heard it before in the dry years, though never this early in the summer and never across this many farms at once. The creeks began to fail too. Birch Creek itself in the open stretches below the Hensley Dam and above the Gasconade shrank to a trickle in the shallow places where the sun reached the water directly. The flow concentrated in the deepest pools where the springs fed it from below, and the bass and the bluegill crowded into those pools the way cattle crowd a shrinking water tank, and the raccoons and the herons worked the pools at dawn and dusk and took the crowded fish one after another until the pools were nearly empty of anything but mud and the bones of what had been eaten. But above the Hensley Dam, where the mill race drew its water, Birch Creek still ran. It ran reduced. The flow had dropped by the 15th of July, and it would drop further by August. But it ran. The dam collected every drop that came down out of the springs in the hills above, and the mill race carried every drop that the dam released, and the gradient that had been surveyed in the 1830s by men whose names no one in the settlement remembered any longer, still worked the way gradients work, which is to say, it did not stop working because the weather had changed, or because a man had died, or because a widow had come back to a burnt place and started to build. Maribel's garden began to show itself around the same time the first wells were failing. She had laid out the plot on the south side of the foundation in late April, 40 feet long and 12 feet wide, and she had run shallow clay-lined ditches from the outside diversion of the mill race across the beds in a pattern that distributed the water evenly without washing the soil. She had planted corn and rows along the north edge, beans on poles in the middle squash, and cucumber on the south edge, where the vines could spread into the unplanted grass beyond the plot, and tomatoes and peppers and potatoes in the space between. She had planted in soil that was watered daily by a 50-year-old stone channel, and the plants had come up in May while the neighbors' plants were still struggling with the cold nights. And by the middle of June, her corn was knee-high while the corn across the creek was 6 inches in yellow at the edges. By the middle of July, when Tobias Pelham's well had failed and the Brannock well was 3 days from failing, Maribel's corn was tasseling. Her beans were climbing the poles, her squash vines were running across the grass. Her tomatoes were setting fruit that had begun to blush at the blossom end, and her potato plants were dark green and standing straight in rows, while the potato plants on Wyatt Kendrick's land 2 miles south were already brown and flat against the cracked earth. She harvested her first tomatoes on the 21st of July. She picked a basket of them in the morning, and she set the basket inside the interior water channel, where the cold creek water kept the fruit firm in the heat of the day, and she thought as she stood up from the channel that she had more tomatoes than one woman living alone could reasonably eat. The thought passed through her and went on, and she did not linger on it because she was 24 and a widow, and she had learned not to linger on thoughts that led toward the question of what she was going to do with her life. But the thought had been there, and she had noticed it, and it would come back to her 2 days later when the horsemen rode up to the edge of the foundation. They arrived on the afternoon of the 23rd of July. Silas Cobb was in front. Behind him were 3 men Maribel had seen in town but did not know well. One was a lawyer from Springfield named Hargrove. One was a surveyor named Peake. The third was a church elder from Turkey Ridge, a man whose opinion on questions of land and water was respected by every farmer within a day's ride of Springfield. Silas cleared his throat. He said the matter he had come about was the water rights on Birch Creek. He said it had come to the attention of several long-established landholders in the county that the diversion at the Hensley Dam was carrying a disproportionate share of the creek's flow in a dry season, and that the downstream properties, which included his own farm and 2 others, were suffering because of that diversion. He said the matter of prior water rights in Missouri was a complicated one, and that under the doctrine of prior appropriation, the oldest continuous use of water on a given watercourse had the strongest claim, and that his own farm had been drawing stock water from Birch Creek since 1856, while the mill dam had been in place since the 1830s but had been said carefully in the hands of successive owners who had not always maintained continuous operation. He said he did not wish to press the matter in court if it could be avoided. He said if Mrs. Hensley were willing to reduce the diversion at her dam by 1/2, or to release the water from the mill pond at specified hours of the day, to allow the downstream properties to draw adequate stock water, the matter could be settled between neighbors without recourse to the county court. Silas said all of this in the careful, measured tone of a man who has rehearsed a speech on the ride over. The tone was not threatening, it was almost apologetic. But the 4 men standing at the edge of the foundation in the mid-afternoon sun with a lawyer and a surveyor and a sheet of folded paper in a coat pocket were not there apologetically, and Maribel Hensley understood what they were. She stood up from where she had been kneeling at the garden. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the edge of the foundation, and she stopped perhaps 6 feet from Silas Cobb. She looked at him. She looked at the lawyer. She looked at the surveyor. She looked at the church elder. She said, "Good afternoon, gentlemen." She said, "Mr. Cobb, I would like to ask you to wait one moment. I need to go inside." She turned. She walked through the door of the stone house. She was inside the house for perhaps 90 seconds. When she came out, she was carrying a leather document wallet that had belonged to Orrin Hensley, a flat case about the size of a large Bible stamped in gilt on the cover with the initials OH. She walked back to the edge of the foundation. She opened the wallet. She drew out 3 documents and she laid them flat on the top course of the foundation wall where the 4 men could see them. The first document was the original deed to the Sawmill property dated the 14th of March, 1879, conveying the land and all appurtenances to Orrin Hensley from the previous owner, a man named Josiah Daniels, who had run the mill from 1851 until his retirement. The deed specifically enumerated the mill dam, the mill race, the foundation of the cutting shed, and the water rights associated with the dam, described as continuous and uninterrupted, since the original grant of the water right in 1834. The second document was a signed affidavit from Josiah Daniels himself dated the 17th of March, 1879. Affirming that the mill had operated continuously from 1851 until the sale, and that his predecessor, a man named Hiram Woodson, had operated the mill continuously from 1834 until 1851, and that therefore the mill's water right had been exercised without interruption for 45 years at the date of the sale to Orrin Hensley. The third document was a letter from the county recorder in Springfield, dated the 2nd of April, 1879, confirming the recording of the deed in the affidavit and attesting to the standing of the water right as senior in priority to any claim on Birch Creek downstream of the dam, except those originating before 1834, of which the letter noted there were none of record. Maribel stepped back from the wall. She said, "Mr. Hargrove, you may examine these at your leisure. I believe you will find that the water right at this dam predates any claim from the Cobb farm by 22 years and is continuous and uninterrupted, including the period since my husband's death, during which I have personally maintained the dam and the mill race and the diversion for the benefit of this property. I am not prepared to reduce the flow, and I am not prepared to release the water at specified hours, and I am not prepared to discuss the matter further this afternoon. If any of you gentlemen would care for a glass of cold water before you ride home, the channel inside my house is running at 48 degrees, and I have a pitcher. If not, I bid you good day." The 4 men looked at the documents. The lawyer picked up the deed. He read it through. He picked up the affidavit. He read it through. He picked up the letter from the county recorder. He read it through. He set the papers back down on the foundation wall, and he looked at Silas Cobb, and he did not speak because there was nothing to be said that would not be worse than silence. Silas looked at Maribel for perhaps 5 seconds. He did not speak either. He turned to his horse. He mounted. The other 3 men mounted. They rode back across the ford at the low water crossing and up the opposite bank, and they did not look back. Maribel stood at the edge of the foundation until they were out of sight. Then she picked up the 3 documents from the wall. She folded them. She put them back in the leather wallet. She carried the wallet inside the house, and she set it on the table beside the water channel, and she put her hand on the cover of the wallet on the gilt initials OH. And she stood there for a long moment with her palm on the leather, and she said under her breath, "Thank you, Orrin." 6 days later, on the 29th of July, Silas Cobb's own well went dry. He did not believe it at first. He worked the pump handle for 10 minutes. He primed it with the last half pitcher of water his wife had been saving in the kitchen. He worked it again. The pump drew air. It drew mud. It drew air again. His wife stood on the porch of the farmhouse with a kitchen towel in her hands, and she did not speak because there was nothing to say. Silas Cobb had 90 head of cattle. He had a team of 4 draft horses. He had a saddle horse, a cow for the family milk, a hog, and 2 dozen chickens. He had a wife and 2 grown sons who had gone to Kansas the year before, and a daughter married in Springfield. He had in the stock tank behind the barn about 200 gallons of water that he had pumped the week before and stored against exactly this possibility, and he had calculated, standing at the dry pump with the handle in his hand, that 200 gallons would water his cattle for perhaps 2 days and a half. He walked to the stock tank. He looked at the water. He walked to the barn. He looked at his cattle. He walked back to the house. He went inside and he sat down at the kitchen table, and he did not speak to his wife for perhaps half an hour. Then he got up. He put on his hat. He walked out to the pasture. He caught his saddle horse. He saddled it. He rode down to the creek, and he crossed at the low water ford, and he rode up the bank to the mill site. Maribel Hensley was in the garden when he rode up. She was picking beans into a split oak basket. She saw him coming from a distance, and she straightened up and she watched him come. He dismounted at the edge of the foundation. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands in front of him, the way a man holds a hat when he does not know what to do with his hands. He did not speak. Maribel did not speak. They stood facing each other across perhaps 8 feet of bare ground, and the only sound between them was the sound of the mill race running through the stone channel at the base of the north wall of her house and the cicadas in the sycamores along the creek. After perhaps a full minute, Silas Cobb said, "Mrs. Hensley." Maribel said, "Mr. Cobb." He said, "My well failed this morning. My stock tank will last 2 days. I have come to ask if I might water my cattle at your mill race." She looked at him. She did not speak for what felt to him like a very long time. In fact, it was perhaps 4 seconds. Then she said, "How many head?" 90, he said, "and 5 horses, and a milk cow." She nodded. She said, "The overflow from the race runs out through the east foundation into a settling pool before it rejoins the creek. You may water your stock at the settling pool. You may come morning or evening. I ask that you not cut the bank when you drive them down. I ask that you let the Pelham and the Kendrick families water first if they are here, because their stock is smaller and their need is greater." Silas nodded. He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Bring 2 barrels with you tomorrow, and I will fill them from the channel inside the house. The water from the channel is colder and cleaner than the water from the overflow, and your wife will want cold water for the kitchen." He nodded again. He did not speak because he could not speak. She saw that he could not speak, and she did not press him, and she turned back to the garden, and she resumed picking beans. And Silas Cobb stood at the edge of the foundation for perhaps another 30 seconds with his hat in his hands, and then he mounted his horse and he rode away. He rode perhaps a quarter-mile up the creek bank on his own side before he stopped the horse. He sat in the saddle for a long time. The sun was low. The cicadas had quieted for the evening. He sat on the horse in the shade of a sycamore, and he wept hard the way a man weeps who has not wept in a very long time and does not know how to stop once he has started. He wept until the horse grew restless and stamped its hoof, and he straightened up in the saddle, and he wiped his face on the sleeve of his shirt, and he rode home. That evening, Maribel sat on the top course of her west wall and watched the sun go down behind the ridge. She had eaten alone at the small table inside the house, as she had eaten alone every night since April. She thought about Silas Cobb. She thought about the half-second hesitation in May, and the 4 men in July, and the man in her garden that afternoon with his hat in his hands. She thought about the rut in the creek bank she had filled in on the 14th of May and had never spoken of and would probably never speak of to anyone, because the fact that the digging had stopped after that day meant either that Silas had understood she had found it or that he had thought better of it on his own. And either way, the matter was finished without a word having been said, which was how some matters on the frontier were best finished. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not something she was ready to give to a man who had tried to divert her water. But she also did not hold on to it the way a person holds on to a stone. Holding on to things she had learned in 8 months of widowhood cost a woman more than the things were worth. She set it aside. She would water his cattle. She would fill his barrels. She would give his wife tomatoes. She would not speak of the rut in the bank. And if he ever came to understand what she had seen, that would be a matter for him and his own conscience. The second family came the next morning. Levi Thorne drove his wagon across the ford at first light with his wife Lucinda on the seat beside him and 2 empty barrels in the wagon bed. Levi was a thin, quiet man of 38 with a dark beard going to gray at the point of the chin. Lucinda was 34 tall with hair the color of wheat straw and a look in her eye that had not slept in 4 days. Their 3 children were at home with Lucinda's mother because there was not enough water at the farm for a trip to town, and the children had been put on half rations of water the day before, a half cup at morning and a half cup at evening, and the youngest, a boy of 4, had begun to cry from thirst in a way a mother remembers for the rest of her life. Maribel filled their barrels from the interior channel. She did not charge. She did not make them ask twice. She gave Lucinda a basket of tomatoes and green beans and 2 small yellow squash, and Lucinda held the basket in her lap on the wagon seat as Levi drove back across the ford, and Lucinda did not speak until they were halfway home, and when she did speak, what she said was, "Levi, that woman saved our children's lives this morning, and we are going to remember it." Levi did not answer, but he nodded once without looking at his wife, and he drove the wagon home in the rising heat of the morning with 2 full barrels behind him and a basket of vegetables in his wife's lap. And by the time they reached their own farm, the sun was high, and the thermometer on the porch was reading 101 degrees at 9 in the morning. Word spread. It spread the way word spreads in a settlement where everyone knows everyone and where a shared calamity compresses the distances between farms. By the 1st of August, the Pelham family was coming daily. The Kendricks were coming every other day. The Brannocks came twice a week because they lived farthest up the ridge, and the wagon trip was long. The Crenshaw family, whose pride had been a matter of public discussion, even in good years, held out the longest. Old Josiah Crenshaw sat on his porch for a week and a half after his well failed, and he watched his garden die, and he watched his wife carry water in a tin cup from the last barrel in the barn, and on the morning when the barrel was empty and the cup was dry, and his wife stood in the kitchen with the empty tin in her hand and looked at him without speaking, Josiah Crenshaw put on his hat and walked the 3 miles to the Hensley Mill site and stood at the edge of the foundation and said, "Mrs. Hensley, my family needs water, and I am asking." Maribel filled his barrels. She gave him tomatoes. She said, "Come back whenever you need to, Mr. Crenshaw. There is no shame in it. It is only water." He nodded. He drove home. He did not speak of it to anyone, but his wife told the Pelham women at church the following Sunday, and the Pelham women told everyone else, and by mid-August, the last family in the settlement that had been holding out against the widow on the mill site had come in from the heat. Maribel organized them. She posted a schedule on a plank nailed to the wall beside her door. Morning hours from sunup to 9 for stock watering at the settling pool. Mid-morning hours from 9 to noon for household barrels filled from the interior channel. Afternoons she kept for herself for the garden, for the building work that continued through the summer as she dug a root cellar and laid her floor mats and built her shelves. Evenings she kept for walking the creek bank because the watch above the dam had not ended when Silas Cobb began coming for water. The watch above the dam would not end until the drought ended, or possibly not even then. The garden gave more than one woman living alone could eat. It gave more than 7 families could carry away. She harvested through July and into August, corn by the bushel, beans by the half bushel, squash and cucumber and tomato and pepper and potato. She preserved what she could. She pickled. She dried. She put down crocks of sliced tomato and salt, and she hung braided ropes of pepper from the rafters to dry, and she stored sacks of dried corn against the north wall of the house, where the interior channel kept the air cool enough to slow the weevils. On the 9th of August, in the middle of the afternoon, the Brannock wagon came up the lane at a dead gallop. Harlan Brannock was not a man who rode at a gallop. He was a careful man, a man who walked his horse down the lane on a Sunday morning, because running a horse in the heat was poor husbandry. But he rode at a gallop on the afternoon of the 9th of August. His wife Hannah sat beside him on the wagon seat with a bundle in her arms that was wrapped in a damp flour sack, and Hannah's face was the face of a woman who had passed beyond fear into the territory that lies on the other side of it. The territory where a mother knows that the next 10 minutes will determine whether her child lives or dies. The bundle was their daughter Ada. She was 6 years old. She had been well that morning, or as well as any child can be in a house where the water has been rationed for 3 weeks, and the mother has been boiling the same pot of beans every other day to stretch the cooking water. At noon, she had complained of a headache. By 3, she had been unable to stand. By 5, her skin had gone dry and hot, and her lips had cracked at the corners, and her eyes had taken on that glazed, distant look a mother recognizes before the doctor has a name for it, the look that says the body has passed the point where it can right itself without help from somewhere outside. Harlan pulled the horse up hard at the edge of the foundation, and he shouted, and Maribel was inside the house at the supper table, and she heard the shout, and she was at the door before the horse had stopped moving. She saw the child in Hannah's arms. She saw the color of the child's face. She had seen a child in that condition once before the summer she was 12, a cousin of hers on the other side of the ridge who had not survived the night. She did not speak. There was no time for speaking. She reached up and she took the child out of Hannah's arms, and she carried her inside the stone house, and she laid her on the floor beside the interior water channel. She knelt beside the child. She pulled the flour sack away. She dipped a clean linen cloth into the flowing water of the channel, and she wrung it out, and she laid it across the child's forehead. She dipped a second cloth and laid it across the child's throat. She dipped a third and pressed it against the inside of each of the child's wrists. The cloths took the child's heat and passed it into the running water, and the running water carried the heat out through the east foundation and down to the creek, and the child's skin, which had been dry and hot to the touch, began within 3 minutes to cool under Maribel's hands. She went to the channel. She lifted out the stoneware jug of buttermilk that Lucinda Thorne had brought her in trade for tomatoes 2 days before. She poured half a cup. She crumbled a pinch of salt into the cup from the tin on the shelf above the stove. She stirred the salt into the buttermilk with a wooden spoon. She lifted the child's head into her lap, and she put the edge of the cup against the child's lips, and she said, "Ada, I need you to swallow this. You do not have to open your eyes, you only have to swallow." The child swallowed. It took 4 minutes to get the half cup into her. Maribel poured another half cup. She added another pinch of salt. She waited 10 minutes. She got the second half cup into the child. She laid the child back on the stone floor beside the channel. She put a fresh, cold cloth on her forehead. She took Hannah Brannock by the elbow, and she sat her down on a chair by the table, and she said, "She will be all right. She is already cooler. You sit down. Harlan, I need you to go out and walk your horse to cool before you tie them. The horses are in worse condition than the child, and you are not going to lose a horse tonight either." Harlan went out. He walked the horses. He did it the way a man does a task he has been given, when he cannot form a thought of his own. Hannah sat at the table and she watched her daughter on the floor, and she did not speak. The two younger Brannock children, a boy of 4 and a girl of 2, stood just inside the door and did not move. Maribel gave each of them a small cup of cold buttermilk from the channel, salted in the same way, and she told them to drink it slowly. They drank it slowly. She gave each of them a slice of cold tomato from the crock in the channel. They ate the tomato as if they had not seen food in a week, which was closer to the truth than any of them wanted to admit aloud. Ada Brannock opened her eyes at 20 minutes past 8 in the evening. She looked up at the stone ceiling of the house. She looked at her mother at the table. She looked at Maribel, kneeling beside her. She said, "Mama, I am cold." Hannah Brannock put her hands over her face and she wept quietly into her palms, and Maribel pulled a wool blanket from the chest against the west wall and laid it over the child from the chest down, leaving the cold cloths on the forehead and the throat. And she said to Hannah, "She is cold because her body is remembering how to be cold. That is good. Let her be cold for a little while longer." Harlan came back in from the horses. He stood in the doorway. He looked at his daughter awake on the floor. He did not enter the room. He stood in the doorway for perhaps a full minute, and then he came inside and he sat down on the floor beside his wife and his daughter, and he put one hand on the child's blanket and one hand on his wife's knee, and he did not speak, because there are moments in a man's life when speech is not equal to what he is feeling, and this was one of those moments, and he would not cheapen it by trying. They stayed until the middle of the night. By 10 o'clock, the child was sitting up. By 11, she was drinking thin soup Maribel had warmed on the stove from the day's beans. By midnight, she was sleeping a natural sleep, her breathing slow and even, the color returned to her face. Maribel told Harlan that he could carry her home in the wagon, or he could leave her on the straw tick in the corner of the stone house until morning and come back for her at first light. Harlan looked at his wife. Hannah said they would stay. Maribel laid out straw ticks on the floor for Hannah and the two younger children. Harlan went to the settling pool and filled 4 canteens and 2 buckets. He drank deeply himself for what may have been the first time in 3 days, and he came back into the house and he lay down on the floor beside his children and he slept. Maribel sat at the table through the rest of that night. She did not sleep. She watched the child. She listened to the water in the channel. The water ran the way the water had been running for 50 years, quiet and steady, and the stone house held its cool air against the hot night outside. And 7 miles in every direction, there were farms where children had not been given enough water to drink that day, and where mothers were sitting up at their own kitchen tables with their hands folded and their mouths silent, and Maribel thought about all of them, and she did not close her eyes until the first gray light of dawn touched the east window, and Ada Brannock stirred on her straw tick and said, "Mama, may I have some more of that milk?" Word traveled fast on a frontier where everyone knew everyone. By the 10th of August, the story of the Brannock child was being told at Durant's store in 3 different versions, all of them more or less accurate. By the 11th, it had reached Turkey Ridge. By the 12th, it had reached the Methodist circuit rider who covered the western half of Greene County, and he would preach on it the following Sunday in 4 different churches without naming Maribel by name, because he did not need to, because every congregation already knew whose mill site he meant. The settlement stopped discussing whether Maribel Hensley had made a good decision in returning to the burnt place. The settlement began discussing instead the question of what was owed to her. Men who had nodded along with Silas Cobb in May, when Silas had said the mill was finished, now found reason to be elsewhere when the subject came up in conversation. Women who had sent sympathetic but dismissive notes after Orrin's funeral now sent baskets of eggs and jars of preserved fruit delivered quietly without occasion with short notes that thanked her for nothing in particular, and therefore thanked her for everything. Maribel did not remark on any of it. She went on building. She dug the root cellar in the northeast corner of the foundation, that August 4 feet deep and 6 feet square, lined with dry stacked limestone covered with heavy planks and a layer of earth. She connected the cellar to the interior channel by a small diversion that kept a shallow pool of creek waters on the cellar floor, and the evaporation from that pool held the humidity in the cellar at the level needed to keep food from drying or spoiling, and the crocks of pickled beans and jars of tomato preserves and smoked pork, wrapped in muslin and sacks of dried corn, she stored there stayed firm and sweet through the worst of the heat. And then on the 21st of August, a polished black phaeton with a hired driver came up the lane from Springfield, and the final trouble of the summer arrived. The man who climbed down from the phaeton was named Thaddeus Rowe. He was 53 years old, heavy in the waist, clean-shaven, in a county where most men wore beards, with a florid face and eyes the color of pale tea and hands that were soft and pink and had never held a shovel. He wore a gray wool suit and a watch chain of gold and a pair of soft town boots that had never been nearer to a creek bank than they were at the moment the driver pulled up at the edge of the foundation. Maribel was in the garden. She saw the phaeton coming from a distance. She had seen Thaddeus Rowe once 2 years before at an auction of farm equipment in Springfield. She had not spoken to him then. She had watched him bid on a team of bulls and win them at a price she had thought foolishly high, and she had watched him walk away from the auction with the mules behind him, and she had thought, that is a man who buys things because he wants them and not because he needs them. And she had not thought of him again until the phaeton came up the lane. He climbed down from the carriage. He introduced himself. He said he had heard a great deal about Mrs. Hensley and her remarkable property. He said he had come to make a proposal. He said if he might be invited into the shade to discuss the matter, he believed he could offer something of considerable benefit to her. Maribel invited him into the shade of the south porch she had built under the 18-inch overhang. She did not invite him inside the house. She offered him water from the channel, which he accepted, and she poured it into a tin cup and handed it to him, and he drank it with an expression of genuine surprise, because cold water in Missouri in late August was not something a man of Thaddeus Rowe's means had tasted in more than 2 months. He came to his proposal. He said he represented a group of investors in Springfield who had been watching the developments in Greene County through the summer with considerable interest. He said the group had identified the Hensley Mill site as a property of exceptional promise. He said the combination of a functioning dam, a cleared mill race, a senior water right, and the demonstrated ability of the property to supply water to a dozen farms simultaneously made it, in the judgment of his investors, the single most valuable piece of real estate in the southwestern part of the county. He said the investors were prepared to offer $2,000 for the property, including all water rights and all improvements. Maribel did not answer immediately. Thaddeus Rowe continued. He said the intention of the investors was to construct a commercial water supply system. The dam would be enlarged. A larger mill race would be cut. A network of distribution lines, wooden pipes buried to prevent freezing, would be run from the property to each farm in the surrounding district. A subscription fee would be charged. Each subscribing farmer would pay, he said, a modest annual sum, in exchange for which he would receive a reliable supply of water through all seasons, wet and dry. He said the system would be, in essence, a private water utility, and it would make the Hensley parcel the most important piece of infrastructure in the county. He said $2,000 would allow Mrs. Hensley to buy a farm of her own in a more congenial location. A farm already improved with a house and a barn and good pasture, in a valley where the water came from a well and not from the inconvenience of a constructed channel. She would have money enough to live comfortably for many years. She would have, he said, the freedom of a woman of means, and she would be spared the hard labor of continuing to maintain a difficult property at the cost, he said kindly, of her youth. He named the figure again, $2,000. He said he had the contract in his valise. He said he would be pleased to have her attorney review it at her convenience. Maribel listened to the whole proposal without speaking. When he had finished, she took the empty tin cup from his hand. She carried it inside the house. She refilled it from the channel. She brought it back out and gave it to him. She said, "Mr. Rowe, I want to be certain I understand you. You are proposing to buy this property, enlarge the dam, cut a larger race, and sell water to the farmers of Greene County at a yearly fee. That is correct," he said. "And the farmers who cannot pay the fee," she said. "What of them?" He smiled. He said that was a matter of private contract. He said any farmer who chose not to subscribe would be free to return to the previous arrangements. He said the system would create, in his view, a strong incentive for all farmers in the district to subscribe because the value of reliable water in a dry year was manifest, and the cost of the fee would be trivial compared to the cost of losing a herd or a crop. She said, and the farmers who do not subscribe and whose wells have failed, what of them? He said again that the system was a voluntary arrangement and that no one would be compelled to participate. Maribel set her hands flat on the porch railing. She looked at Thaddeus Rowe in the way she had looked at the foundation when she first climbed down from the wagon in April, not at what a thing was pretending to be, but at what it was actually doing. She said, "Mr. Rowe, I am going to decline your offer." She said it in the same clear voice she had used with Silas Cobb in May. She did not raise her voice. She did not explain at length. She said she appreciated his trouble in riding out from Springfield, and she was sorry he had come so far for an answer he would not be pleased to hear, but the property was not for sale, and the water right was not for sale, and she was not interested in hearing a revised offer at any figure he might care to name. Thaddeus Rowe set the tin cup down on the railing of the porch. He adjusted the set of his hat. He said he was sorry to hear her answer. He said he wished to make one thing clear as a matter of professional courtesy. He said if she was not willing to sell, his investors would be compelled to pursue other avenues. He said the senior water right on Birch Creek was, in his opinion, a matter that could be reviewed in court, and that a number of the downstream landholders, including Mr. Silas Cobb, had expressed previous interest in such a review. He said it would be regrettable if the matter came to litigation. He said he trusted she would reconsider before such an unhappy course became necessary. She looked at him. After perhaps 5 seconds, she said, "Mr. Rowe, you have had your water. I believe you have business elsewhere. Good day." He tipped his hat. He climbed into the phaeton. The driver turned the horses and the carriage rolled down the lane toward the Springfield road. Maribel watched it go. Then she went back into the garden and she picked tomatoes until dusk, because picking requires hands and thinking requires time, and she had learned to do one before she allowed herself the other. That evening, after the supper was cleared, she sat by the window and she allowed herself to think about what Thaddeus Rowe had said. He had not come alone to Springfield to have the conversation. He had named Silas Cobb as a downstream landholder who had expressed interest in a legal review of the water right. That meant Rowe had spoken to Silas before he rode out to the mill site. That meant Silas Cobb, who had been drawing water from her race every morning for 4 weeks, who had been given tomatoes and cucumbers and green beans by a woman who could have turned him away, was entangled in the Rowe proposal in some way she did not yet understand. She needed to know how deep the entanglement went. She needed to know before Rowe came back or before his lawyers did. In the morning at first light, she walked down to the settling pool. Silas arrived at 6 with his barrels. She waited until the barrels were filled. She asked him to step aside with her for a moment. He did. They walked about 30 feet from the pool. She asked him plainly, "Mr. Cobb," she said, "did Thaddeus Rowe come to see you before he came to see me?" Silas looked at her. His face changed. Something in it opened and something else closed, the way a man's face moves when he is deciding between the truth and the version of the truth that protects him, and the decision goes one way. He said yes. Rowe had come. She said, "What did you tell him?" Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had told Rowe that he was not interested in participating in any legal action against Mrs. Hensley's water right, and that he would not sign any paper to that effect now or in the future, and that if Rowe was looking for a downstream landholder to join his suit, he would have to look elsewhere. Maribel looked at him for a long moment. She said, "In your land. Did he offer to buy your land?" Silas said he had offered. He said Rowe had offered $1,500 for his farm, which was more than the farm had cost him in 1856 and more than he could have gotten for it in any other year. Rowe had said the two properties together would make the water utility workable. Rowe had said Silas could retire to town with his wife and live comfortably. Rowe had, Silas said, made a considerable effort to persuade him. Maribel said, "And you declined." "I declined," Silas said. She said, "Why?" He looked at her. He did not answer for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he said, "Because a man does not sell his neighbor's water to a stranger from town. Not when his neighbor has been letting him water his cattle for 4 weeks and has not asked him for a dime." He paused. He looked at the ground. Then he looked back at her and he said something else, something she had not expected. "And because I owe you more than cattle water, Mrs. Hensley, I owe you an accounting. In May, before the drought, I had a man dig a cut in the bank above your dam. A diversion. He got it half done before I thought better of it and called him off. I do not know if you ever saw it." Maribel looked at him. Her face did not change. "I saw it," she said. "I filled it in." Silas closed his eyes for a moment. He nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when a thing he has carried in silence is finally set down. "I reckon you had," he said. She said, "Why are you telling me now?" "Because Rowe is coming at you with lawyers," he said, "and if this goes to court, I want to stand on your side of it. And a man cannot stand on a woman's side in front of a judge if he has not first told her the worst thing he has done to her. I will not carry that into a courtroom. Not for Rowe, not for anyone." She did not thank him. She did not forgive him. She nodded once and she turned and walked back to the house, and Silas Cobb loaded his barrels into the wagon and drove home. Thaddeus Rowe's lawsuit was filed in the circuit court at Springfield on the 3rd of September, 1886. The suit named Mrs. Maribel Hensley as defendant and alleged that her water right on Birch Creek was defective, that the diversion at her dam constituted an unreasonable taking of water from downstream holders, and that the recent drought had caused economic damages to downstream landholders that were the direct responsibility of the holder of the Hensley Dam. The suit sought an injunction requiring Mrs. Hensley to reduce her diversion by half, plus damages in the amount of $600. The suit was heard on the 17th of September. Maribel had no lawyer. She could not afford a lawyer. $2,000 had been offered to her for the property, and she had turned it down. And $600 in damages was being demanded of her, and she had in the coffee tin on the shelf beside the stove $11.35. She rode to Springfield in Harlan Brannock's wagon on the morning of the 17th, accompanied by Harlan and by Lucinda Thorne. She wore the same faded cotton work dress she wore to the garden because she did not own another, and she carried Orrin's leather document wallet under her arm, And she sat on the wagon seat with her back straight and her hands folded, and she looked at the road ahead, and she did not speak for the entire ride. The courtroom was on the second floor of the county courthouse, a room with high windows and dark woodwork, and a bench at the front where Judge Elias Fairchild presided. Fairchild was 68 years old, a former cavalry officer who had ridden with Fremont in the early days and who had been sitting on the Greene County bench for 19 years. He was known for two things: he was patient and he did not suffer nonsense. Thaddeus Rowe sat at the plaintiff's table with a lawyer from Springfield named Whitfield, a man in a dark suit who had a thick file of papers and a confident expression. Rowe himself sat with his legs crossed and his watch chain gleaming, and the air of a man who has already calculated the outcome and found it favorable. Maribel sat at the defendant's table alone. Judge Fairchild looked at the two tables. He looked at the lawyer at the plaintiff's table. He looked at the woman sitting alone at the defendant's table with a leather wallet in front of her. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, "do you have counsel?" "No, Your Honor." "Do you wish the court to appoint counsel?" "No, Your Honor, I will speak for myself." The judge looked at her over the top of his spectacles for a long moment. Then he nodded. The plaintiff's lawyer spoke first. He spoke for 35 minutes. He laid out the case methodically. He cited the doctrine of prior appropriation. He cited the doctrine of reasonable use. He cited case law from 3 different states. He argued that the Hensley Dam, while possessing a senior water right on paper, had not been in continuous operation since the fire of 1885, and that the interruption in operation, however brief, had weakened the priority of the right. He argued that the downstream landholders had suffered measurable harm during the drought of 1886, and that the diversion at the Hensley Dam had been the proximate cause of that harm. He produced affidavits from 2 farmers who said their wells had failed sooner than they would have otherwise because of the reduction in creek flow caused by the dam. He did not produce an affidavit from Silas Cobb. He had tried. Silas had refused. When the lawyer finished, Judge Fairchild looked at Maribel. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, "you may respond." Maribel stood up. She opened the leather wallet. She laid the 3 documents flat on the table in front of her, the same 3 documents she had shown Silas Cobb and the 4 men in July. She did not argue doctrine. She did not cite case law. She did not know case law. She knew stone and water and the sound a mill race makes when the gradient is true and the channel is clear. She said, "Your Honor, I have 3 documents I would like the court to examine. The first is the deed to my property, which enumerates the water right and describes it as continuous and uninterrupted since 1834. The second is a sworn affidavit from the previous owner of the mill, Mr. Josiah Daniels, attesting to 51 years of continuous operation from 1834 to 1885. The third is a letter from the county recorder confirming the recording and the standing of the right." She paused. She looked at the judge. "I would also like to say, Your Honor, that the plaintiff's lawyer has argued that my water right was interrupted by the fire of October 1885. The fire destroyed the cutting shed and the drying racks. It did not damage the dam. It did not damage the mill race. It did not damage the stone foundation on which I have built my home. The water continued to flow through the race without interruption during and after the fire, through the winter of 1885 to 1886, and through the spring and summer of 1886 to the present day. I have maintained the dam and the race personally since April of this year. I have cleared the channel of silt and debris. I have reset the stones. I have diverted the water to its lawful uses on my own property. The water right has not been interrupted, not by the fire, not by my husband's death, not by anything." She paused again. The courtroom was quiet. I would also like to say, Your Honor, that I have no lawyer. I am 24 years old. I am a widow. I have $11 to my name. The plaintiff is offering $2,000 for my property and suing me for $600 in damages. And he has a lawyer in a dark suit and a file of papers, and I have a leather wallet and 3 documents in the truth, and I believe the truth is sufficient. She sat down. The judge looked at the 3 documents. He read the deed. He read the affidavit. He read the letter from the county recorder. He set them down. He looked at the plaintiff's lawyer. Mr. Whitfield, he said, have you examined these documents? The lawyer said he had not had the opportunity. The judge handed them across. The lawyer read them. His face changed as he read. Not by much, just enough for a man who had been in courtrooms for 19 years to notice. The judge looked at the courtroom. He said, is there anyone present who wishes to offer testimony bearing on the question of whether the Hensley water right has been continuously exercised? A chair scraped in the gallery. A tall man with a long gray mustache stood up. He was wearing a suit that did not fit him well because Silas Cobb had not worn a suit in 4 years and had gained weight in the interval, and the collar was tight at his neck, and his face was red, and he stood with the stiffness of a man who has come to say something he has been thinking about for a long time. Your Honor, Silas said, my name is Silas Cobb. I own the farm directly across Birch Creek from the Hensley property. I have been a neighbor of that property since 1856. The judge said, do you wish to offer testimony, Mr. Cobb? I do, Your Honor. The judge swore him in. Silas stood at the front of the courtroom with his hand on the Bible, and he told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and then he spoke. He said the mill had operated continuously under its water right until the fire of 1885. He said the water right had been exercised in other forms by Mrs. Hensley since her inheritance of the property in April of 1886. He said the diversion at the Hensley Dam had not in his own judgment caused any unreasonable harm to his own farm or to any other downstream property, including during the present drought. He said Mrs. Hensley had in fact provided water from her mill race to his farm and to 7 other farms in the district since July without charge, without condition, and without complaint, and that she had done so while building a stone house with her own hands and maintaining a garden that had fed half the settlement through the worst drought in 20 years. He paused. He looked at the judge. I would also like to say, Your Honor, that Mr. Rowe offered me $1,500 for my farm before he filed this suit. He said the 2 properties together would make his water company workable. I declined. I declined because a man does not sell his neighbor's water to a stranger from town. And I declined because Mrs. Hensley has done more for this settlement in 4 months than I have done in 30 years. And I will not stand by while a man in a fine suit tries to take it from her. The courtroom was very quiet. Thaddeus Rowe uncrossed his legs and crossed them again. His lawyer was looking at the table. Judge Fairchild sat in silence for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he spoke. The court finds as follows. The water right at the Hensley Dam on Birch Creek is senior in priority to all downstream claims of record. The right has been continuously exercised from 1834 to the present date. The fire of October 1885 destroyed structures on the property, but did not interrupt the flow of water through the dam or the mill race, and the current owner has maintained the dam, the race and the diversion since April 1886 in a manner consistent with the continuous exercise of the right. The plaintiff's claim of interruption is without merit. The injunction is denied. The claim for damages is denied. Costs are assessed to the plaintiff. He looked at Thaddeus Rowe over the top of his spectacles. Mr. Rowe, he said, I would suggest that the next time you wish to acquire a piece of property, You begin by asking its owner, and if the owner says no, you accept the answer. This court is not in the business of compelling widows to sell their land to men who can afford better lawyers. Case dismissed. He struck the gavel once. The sound echoed off the high walls of the courtroom like a door closing. Thaddeus Rowe and his lawyer left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. They were seen boarding the eastbound train the following morning, and they did not return to Greene County. Maribel rode home in Harlan Brannock's wagon at the end of that day, with Silas Cobb riding alongside on his saddle horse. She sat on the wagon seat between Harlan and Lucinda. They did not speak for the first 3 miles. Then Maribel said, "Mr. Cobb." "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Yes, ma'am." That was all that was said between them on the ride home, and it was enough, and they did not need to say more of it ever again. The rain came back on the 29th of September. It came back the way rain comes back to a country that has been dry, not all at once. A few cloud in the morning, a short shower in the afternoon that wet the top inch of soil and did nothing for the subsoil, a longer shower the next day, a steady rain on the third day that ran in the dust of the roads and gathered in the low places and began at last to soak into the ground. The wells began to recover on the second week of October. Birch Creek came up 2 inches, then 4, then 6. By the 1st of November, the creek was running at its normal level. The cattle came off the stock tanks and back to the creek for water. The pastures greened at the edges. The winter wheat went into ground that would hold a plow. The settlement returned to its own water. The families who had come to the mill race in July and August went back to their own wells with the particular awareness of what their own wells had failed to do and what the mill race had done instead. No one said it aloud, but the next summer when a man from Turkey Ridge came asking about buying a load of lumber, Maribel had no intention of producing. The settlement turned him toward her for the matter he actually needed, which was the hiring of a mason to line a new well against the possibility of another dry summer, because Maribel Hensley knew stone, and the settlement now knew that Maribel Hensley knew stone, and the settlement now paid for what it needed with money and respect in equal measure. She sold the 5-foot circular saw blade that autumn to a mill operator in Springfield for $12. She used the money to buy a breeding pair of dairy goats, a small iron cook stove, and 4 panes of window glass. The goats grazed the creek bank and gave her milk she could sell in town. The stove heated the house through the winter. The window glass replaced the oiled canvas she had used through the summer. By the following spring, she had added fruit trees along the race bank, apple and peach, which thrived on the constant moisture and began to bear in the 3rd year. She built a small stone spring house over the point where the race entered the foundation, and the cold water kept milk and butter and cheese fresh through the hottest summers Missouri could produce. She did not rebuild the sawmill. She never rebuilt the sawmill. Orrin had written at the bottom of the plan beneath the flagstone that if the mill should fail, this was what the land would still give her. And the land had given her what he had said it would give, and she did not need to rebuild a thing that had already given way to something better suited to a woman living alone on the ground where it stood. She did not remarry. Silas Cobb never spoke to her of marriage, and she was grateful for that because a proposal from Silas would have obliged her to answer him, and answering him would have cost their friendship a thing it could not afford. They were friends instead. He came to the mill site once a week through every summer for the rest of his life. He helped her with the heavy work she could not do alone, the resetting of a dam stone dislodged by winter ice, the replacement of a rafter damaged by a fallen limb. She fed him supper. She gave him tomatoes. She listened to him talk about his cattle. His wife came too on occasion, and the 3 of them sat on the porch under the 18-inch overhang, in the evenings, and they watched the water running in the race and did not always speak, and the silence between them was the silence of people who had come through a bad summer together and had not forgotten it. On an evening in the late August of 1887, a year to the week after the hottest days of the drought, Silas Cobb sat on the top course of the west wall of the foundation, and he watched the water flow through the race and into the garden ditches and through the interior channel and out the east foundation. He listened to the sound of it, the constant quiet rush that was the sound of a system working, the sound of water doing what water does when you give it a channel and a gradient and get out of its way. He said, "Every man in this county dug a well. You inherited a ditch." Maribel was sitting on the step of the south porch. She was shelling beans into a tin pan in her lap. She did not look up. She said, "I inherited a system. The ditch is just the part you can see." Silas nodded. He did not answer. He watched the water for a while longer. The years turned over. The seasons came and went the way seasons do in the Ozarks, hot summers and cold winters, and the green springs and the burning autumns in between. Maribel ran the garden and the dairy and the fruit trees, and she laid stone for anyone who asked. And she was asked often because the word had gone out across 3 counties that the widow on Birch Creek knew stone the way some men know horses by feel and by instinct, and by a kind of understanding that cannot be taught in a school, but only learned by a hand against a wall. She took in 2 young widows over the course of those years, women from other settlements who had lost husbands and had nowhere to go. She gave them work. She taught them the stone and the water. She showed them how to read the gradient and how to seal a joint and how to listen for the sound a channel makes when the flow is right. She sent them on when they were ready to stand on their own, and she did not ask them to stay because she understood that a woman who has been helped must eventually help herself, and staying too long in someone else's shelter is a way of forgetting how to build your own. Silas Cobb died in the autumn of 1897. He was 67. His heart gave out on a Tuesday morning while he was walking his pasture, and he fell face down in the grass between 2 of his own cattle, and his wife found him there an hour later with the morning dew still on his hat. They buried him in the family plot on the ridge above his farm, and Maribel stood at the back of the gathering the way she had stood at the back of other gatherings, quiet and apart, and she did not weep where anyone could see. She wept that evening alone, sitting on the top course of the west wall of her foundation, with a tin cup of cold water from the channel in her hand, looking at the ridge where Silas had lived for 40 years, and where his chimney now stood dark. She wept for perhaps 3 minutes. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve, and she went inside, and she banked the fire, and she checked the channel, and she went to bed. His wife Elspeth promised Silas on his deathbed that she would see Maribel through whatever came. Elspeth was a practical woman who understood that a promise made to a dying man is a different kind of promise than any other, and she kept it. The winter of 1899 was the hardest since the drought year. The cold came in December and did not let up through January, and the ice on Birch Creek grew thick enough to walk on, and the mill race slowed to a trickle as the surface froze and the channel walls contracted in the bitter air. Maribel walked the race every morning at first light, the way she had walked the creek bank above the dam in the summer of 1886, because the channel was her system and the system needed tending, and the tending did not stop because the weather had changed. She was 37 years old that winter. She was still 5 feet 2. She still weighed 110 pounds, but her hands had thickened at the knuckles from 13 years of laying stone, and her face had weathered to the color of the limestone she worked with, and there was a cough in her chest that had been there since November, and that she did not speak of to Elspeth or to anyone, because speaking of a cough in winter was a way of inviting the cough to stay. On the morning of the 14th of January, she went out to break ice from the channel at the northwest corner of the foundation. The temperature was 4 degrees above zero. The ice on the channel was 2 inches thick, and she struck it with the flat of a shovel the way she always struck it, 3 sharp blows to crack the surface, and then a sweep to clear the fragments. The water underneath was still flowing, still cold, still steady. She could hear it running beneath the ice, the way you can hear a heartbeat beneath a chest, muffled but constant, the sound of a system that does not stop. She stood at the channel for perhaps 10 minutes longer than she should have. The cold came in through her boots and through her coat and through the wool scarf she had wrapped twice around her throat. The cough came up once hard, and she bent forward with her hand on the stone wall, and she let it pass, and she straightened, and she went back inside. The cough did not pass. It settled in the way the cold settles into stone, deep and slow and patient. By the end of January, she was coughing through the night. By the 1st of February, she could not walk the race without stopping twice to catch her breath. By the middle of February, Elspeth Cobb, who had been riding across the creek every other day to bring soup and firewood, and the particular fierce tenderness of a widow tending a widow, told Maribel that she was going to send for the doctor whether Maribel wanted her to or not. The doctor came. He listened to her chest. He shook his head. He left a bottle of medicine on the table. He did not charge her for it. Maribel knew what that meant. She had known what that meant since she was 17 years old, watching Oren's mother die of the same thing in the same kind of winter, in a house not so different from this one. She spent the last 2 weeks of February in bed. Elspeth sat up with her through the nights. Lucinda Thorne came during the days. Hannah Brannock sent Ada, who was now 14 and tall and strong, and who carried firewood and broke ice from the channel and tended the dairy goats with a competence that reminded Maribel in her fever of her own hands at that age. On the last night, the 27th of February, 1900, Elspeth was sitting beside the bed. The stone house was warm. The channel was running. The sound of the water in the stone was the same sound it had always made, quiet and constant, the sound of a system that works. Maribel opened her eyes. She looked at Elspeth. She said, "Is the channel clear?" Elspeth said, "Ada cleared it this morning. It is running fine." Maribel nodded. She turned her head toward the wall. She put her hand out, and she pressed her palm flat against the interior face of the limestone, the same wall she had laid stone by stone in the summer of 1886, the wall that was 18 inches thick and cool to the touch. Even now, even in February, even with a fire in the hearth, because limestone remembers the cold the way it remembers the heat, patient and deep and without hurry. She said, "The water is still running." "It is," Elspeth said. Maribel closed her eyes. Her hand stayed on the stone. The water ran in the channel at the base of the north wall, and the sound of it filled the room, the way it had filled the room every day and every night for 14 years. And Maribel Hensley breathed in time with the sound of it, slow and steady, and then lower, and then steady again, and then she was quiet. She was 38 years old. She had been a widow for 15 years. She had built a stone house with her own hands on the foundation her husband had left her. She had saved a child's life with cold water and salt. She had fed 7 families through a drought. She had stood alone in a courtroom and won. She had taken in 2 women with nothing and sent them out with the knowledge of how to build. She had turned a ruin into a system and a system into a life, and the system was still running when she died, and it would go on running for 60 more years. They buried her on the ridge beneath the white oak tree beside Oren, under a limestone marker she had cut herself 10 years before and stored in the back of the spring house against the day she would need it. The marker was simple: her name, his name, the dates, and one line at the bottom carved in her own hand in the same careful letters Orrin had used when he drew his plans. The water is still running. The mill race ran for another 63 years after her death. The dam held until 1963, when a spring flood finally carried away the packed earth core, and the stone facing went with it. By then, the stone house had passed through 4 owners and had been extended twice. The garden she had laid out in 1886 was still producing, tended by a great niece of Harlan Brannock, who had married a man from Joplin and had come back to the creek because the land was in her blood, the way water is in stone, deep and quiet and impossible to get out. The interior water channel along the north wall had been converted to a decorative feature because the house had city water by then, but the channel still ran fed by a small pipe off the main line, because the family living there liked the sound it made, and some sounds, once you have heard them, you do not want to live without. On a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1950, 50 years after Maribel's death, a young woman drove up the lane to the mill site in a truck that had seen better days. She was 22 years old. She had dark hair and a thin face and the particular look in her eyes that comes to a woman who has lost something large and has not yet found a way to set it down. Her husband had been killed in Korea 3 months before. She had no children. She had no family within 100 miles. She had heard about the stone house on Birch Creek from a woman at a church supper in Springfield, a woman who had said, "If you need a place to think, go see the Hensley place. The woman who lives there will give you water and she will not ask you any questions." The young woman pulled up at the edge of the foundation. She got out of the truck. She stood in the yard and she looked at the stone house. The walls were thick and weathered and beautiful in the late afternoon light, the limestone glowing the soft pink that Maribel had seen on the first evening of July in 1886, the color that comes only at that hour of that kind of day. The roof was cedar shingles replaced twice since the original green with moss on the north slope. The porch ran along the south wall under the 18-inch overhang, and on the porch, in a wooden rocking chair, sat an old woman with silver hair and a face like weathered stone. The old woman was the great niece. She was 81 years old. She had lived in the house for 30 years. The young woman walked to the porch. She stood at the bottom of the steps and she looked up at the old woman, and she did not speak because she did not know what to say, because she was 22 and her husband was dead and the world did not make sense, and she had driven 100 miles to see a stone house because a woman at a church supper had told her to. The old woman looked at her. She did not ask her name. She did not ask where she had come from. She did not ask what had brought her. She said, "Come inside, I want to show you something." The young woman followed her inside. The house was cool. The stone walls held the temperature the way they had always held it, patient and deep. The old woman led her to the north wall. She pointed at the channel. The water was running in the stone trough, clear and cold, the same sound Maribel had heard on the 9th of July in 1886, the same sound she had fallen asleep to for 14 years, the same sound that had been running in that house for 64 years without stopping. "Put your hand in," the old woman said. The young woman knelt. She put her hand in the water. It was cold. 48 degrees, the same temperature it had been when it came out of the spring in the hills above the dam in 1834 and in 1886 and in 1900 and now. She held her hand at the water for a long time. The cold ran between her fingers and over her wrist and up her arm and into her chest, and it did not take anything from her. It gave her something instead. Not warmth, something older than warmth. Something that had been moving through this channel for longer than anyone alive could remember, steady and constant and patient, carrying the cold from the spring and the memory of every hand that had ever touched it, and the young woman knelt on the stone floor with her hand in the running water, and she wept because she understood in the way that grief sometimes opens a door into understanding that some things do not stop. Some things run. Some things, once they are given a channel and a gradient and a reason, go on and on and on. The old woman stood behind her and did not speak. After a while, the young woman pulled her hand out of the water. She wiped it on her skirt. She stood up. "Who built this?" she said. The old woman smiled. "A woman," she said. "A woman about your age. She built it out of the ruins of a sawmill with her own two hands, and the water has been running through it ever since, and it has not stopped once, not for drought, not for flood, not for foreign, not for war, not for the death of anyone who ever lived inside these walls. It does not stop. That is the thing about water. You cannot build it, but you can build everything around it, and the water will do the rest." The young woman looked at the channel. The water ran over the limestone slabs, clear and cold and constant, and the sound it made was the sound of something that has been given a shape and a direction, and has simply kept going the way water keeps going, the way grief keeps going, the way love keeps going, even after the person who gave it a channel is no longer there to tend it. She stood in the stone house for a long time. Then she walked outside and she got in her truck and she drove away, and she came back the following week and the week after that. And within the year, she had moved into the small room on the east side of the house that the great niece no longer used. And she learned to tend the channel and the garden and the goats, and she lived there for 11 years. And when she left, she knew how to build with stone and how to read a gradient and how to listen for the sound a system makes when the flow is right. She did not know Maribel Hensley's name until the day she found the tin box beneath the flagstone in the southeast corner of the foundation. She knelt on the stone floor and she lifted the paper out of the tin, and she saw the drawing in a hand she did not recognize, and she read the measurements in the notes in the line at the bottom, the line that said, "If the mill should fail, this is what the land will still give you." And she understood that she was holding in her hands the beginning of everything she had been living inside for 11 years. She put the paper back in the tin. She put the tin back in the hollow. She set the flagstone back in place. She stood up. Outside, the water ran in the mill race, quiet and steady, the way it had been running since 1834, and the sun was going down behind the ridge, and the light was safed in pink against the old stone walls. And somewhere in the sycamores along the creek a wood thrush was singing, and the woman stood in the doorway of the stone house, and she listened to the water and the bird and the wind in the trees, and she said under her breath to no one living and to everyone who had ever lived inside those walls, "Thank you." Some things a person builds, some things a person inherits and then completes, and some things a person passes on to those who come after, whether they ever know the name of the hand that shaped them or not. Water is the one thing a person cannot build, but a woman alone on a burnt homestead with a husband's plan beneath a flagstone and a stone channel running from a dam to a garden can build everything around the water, and the water will do the rest. And the rest, it turns out, is most of what matters.